Thank you for that, Jordan. In communicating with Susanna this week about what I was going to speak about and speaking on Esther, I said that the title really should be The Right Woman in the Right Place at the Right Time. I think that's what we're going to learn as we learn more about Esther and what her role was in that really critical story we heard some of in Esther chapter 4. So in a service led in every respect by women at All Souls tonight, we're going to examine the life of a Jewish orphan girl living in exile in the 5th century BC who became Queen of Persia, and also, through her obedience to God, acted to save her people from death and destruction. So unbeknownst to Esther, for some time, she was the right woman in the right place at the right time. At a time such as this, where her faith and even her right to exist was under threat. We'll find many parallels with our own place today. We'll be reminded of God's providence and his sovereignty in ensuring the protection of his people whilst they were in exile, so that his new covenant through Christ Jesus could be extended to us all. And finally, we can reflect on our own call to obedience and faithful service in the places that we find ourselves and in a time such as this. I feel like the choice of Esther tonight is a little controversial in that it is a book in the Old Testament that does not mention God or his covenant with his chosen people. But it is part of the Old Testament, it's part of our canon, and God's hiddenness, I don't think, should be interpreted as his absence. So just like Joseph and Daniel, God is with Esther and her people as they are strangers in a foreign land and in a hostile culture. The hand of God and the protection of his chosen people can clearly be seen, even though it's not referred to. In this way, the story of Esther is part of the progression of God's covenant that culminates with Jesus Christ in the New Testament, in a covenant in which we all share. God used Esther to effect his unfolding plan for his people and as intentions of his covenant through Christ. So who was Esther? Let's think a little bit more about who she was. The book of Esther is one of only 2 Old Testament books named after a woman, the other one being Ruth. So Esther's role in saving her people takes place amongst a community of Jews living in the Persian Empire in the 5th century BC. So Babylon had become part of the Persian Empire when it was conquered by Cyrus the Great. And even though King Cyrus had granted the Jews the freedom to return to their homeland and rebuild the temple, most had actually stayed in Persia. And Esther is a member of the Jewish community in Susa, which is the winter capital of Persia. There's only ruins today of the once great city that stood there, but the historians have found the remains of that city in modern Iran. So after King Cyrus's reign, there was a new Persian king, Xerxes. He had, interestingly, disposed of his wife Vashti when she refused to appear before him. So he was looking for a new queen. And Esther ended up as a member of a harem who were all effectively auditioning for a role as queen. It was a very crude and exploitative version of The Bachelor, I think you can say, and Esther was moved to the palace where she was accommodated with only other members of the harem and the eunuchs who looked after them. She was an orphan who had been raised by her uncle or a close family member, Mordecai, who you heard about in the reading. And he had counselled her to keep her Jewish identity a secret when she entered the palace, which she did. The book of Esther tells us that Esther found favour with the head eunuch there. And in following his advice, then she was finally taken to the king, with whom she also found favour, and King Xerxes chose to make her his queen. Although clearly an elevated position, it does not seem to have been one with much inherent influence and authority. And we know this because of how quickly the previous queen was moved on when she failed to comply with the direction from the king, and also because of the strict rules and protocols that were in place in the palace that meant she was not even able to appear before the king unless she was requested to do so, with the punishment that we heard about in chapter 4, the punishment of death. One person who did have influence and power well in excess of that of Esther is Haman, the king's chief counselor. He was effectively the king's minister. Haman clearly enjoyed great wealth, influence and access to the king, and he had no end of ill will towards the Jewish people who were living in Susa, including quite specifically Queen Esther's family member, Mordecai, who had refused to bow down to him. So he had a deep animus to Mordecai, and that extended to all the Jewish people living in Susa. So by the end of chapter 3 in Esther, we have an unpredictable and capricious king with a Jewish queen who so far kept her Jewish identity a secret. Haman is embedded as the chief counselor who has a hatred for Mordecai, Esther's family member, and the Jewish people, and has active plans to do them harm. The stage is set for the dramatic events, and this has been accomplished in a way that Esther cannot appreciate until her purpose as queen becomes clear. At the end of chapter 3, Haman has successfully persuaded the king to issue a decree for the annihilation of the Jews in Susa. Esther is oblivious to this development at first, but in chapter 4 she's informed of the situation by one of the eunuchs whom she is sent to speak with Mordecai. Through the messenger of the eunuch, Mordecai urges Esther to go and plead for the lives of her people. Initially, Esther is cautious to intervene in that she sets out the difficulty and risk for her in going to see the king without being requested. She points out that the king has not sent for her for over 30 days, which may indicate that she's already out of favour before she risks inflaming the king further. She responds to a further challenge from Mordecai, however, when he sends another message to her that is probably the most well-known verses there in Esther. In verse 14, Mordecai says to Esther, "For if you remain," through the messenger, he says to her, "if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance for the Jews will arise from another place, but you and your father's family will perish. And who knows but that you have come to a royal position for such a time as this." At this challenge, Esther sends word to Mordecai to gather together all the Jews in Susa and to fast for 3 days and nights, as she will too, as she prepares to go to the king to plead for the life of the Jews. And she ends with the words that evidence the extent of her faith and resolve when she says, "And if I die, I die." Unlike the queen who went before her, who risked everything by not appearing before the king when she was summoned to do so, Esther's going to risk everything by appearing before the king when he has not asked to see her. Her presence has not been sought. So chapter 4 ends as it began with the actions of Mordecai, but the major change has been achieved with Queen Esther now ready to speak for her people. God's sovereignty and plan is also becoming clearer, and Esther has embraced her placement as queen for such a time as this. Mordecai has made Esther realise that she is not where she is by accident, but that she can choose not to act to save herself and her people. We don't know, but it could be that Esther had up to that point thought that it was a pretty lucky outcome for her finding favour with the king and finding herself as the Queen of Persia. We just don't know. The references to her finding favour with the eunuchs and the king may indicate that she had an all-round winning personality, and she was certainly beautiful. We're told that she was certainly beautiful. We don't know if she had a sense of purpose and destiny in her position as queen up to that point, but we know she certainly embraced that purpose in chapter 4 and made the decision that her purpose was not to live that life of luxury and ease, but to be God's agent of deliverance for her people, and that it may cost her the privileged position she was in and may even cost her her life. It's important not to underestimate the extent of Esther's courage in taking this action when she committed to plead for her people. It's apparent that she herself recognised this by the preparation she asked from all the Jewish people in Susa, and that she undertook herself. 3 days of fasting. I would expect there was prayer attached to that, even though it's not mentioned. It was certainly a time of discipline and in which she was preparing and focusing on her intended action. Her initial reticence makes clear to us that she was certainly cognizant of the risk to her life that she was taking in setting herself against Haman, who was the second most powerful man in the kingdom after her husband the king, and in appearing before the king without his permission. If he did not deign to forgive her for this by extending his sceptre, she may be banished or killed, and certainly would lose her position. In reflecting on Esther's courage, I can't help but recall a book I'm reading at the moment, actually, which is a life of Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who was a German theologian and pastor. And as a German pastor in Nazi Germany, he felt he had to act against the Nazi Party and its persecution of the Jewish people, and also its oppression of the German church and of Christian beliefs. And so he risked everything to participate in the German resistance, including in a direct plot against Hitler, and he was executed by the Nazis in the final days of World War II. Like Esther, who was aware of the precariousness of her earthly life when she said, "If I die, I die," Bonhoeffer took that enormous risk to his personal safety, but was similarly convicted about the necessity of his course of action. He himself had ample opportunities during the Nazi regime to stay in safety in the UK or America, where he was working really actively against the Nazi regime, but he chose to return to face the evil forces being arranged against the Jews and also the Christian church in Germany. Like Esther, he did not count the cost of his faith, and his example and writings provide great encouragement to millions of Christians today. Both Bonhoeffer and Esther knew that if they did not act out their faith, then others would, but that they would not be demonstrating their obedience to God and to his plan. Mordecai said this directly to Esther when he told her in verse 14, "If you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance for the Jews will arise from another place, but you and your father's family will perish." So Esther acted with courage and obedience to choose to obey God. Esther had to choose whether to obey, as we all do. In making this choice, Bonhoeffer himself said that faith is only real when there is obedience, never without it, and faith only becomes faith in the act of obedience. We've not read all of the book of Esther tonight, so I'll issue a spoiler alert warning for those who are not familiar with the story, but we'll confirm that the king was sympathetic to Esther's entreaties on behalf of her people. And in a stunning reversal of fortune, Haman, who had obtained the king's authority to kill all the Jews in Susa, ended up being hanged on the very same gallows he had constructed for Mordecai. The Jewish people in Susa were saved from death. Mordecai became the king's new chief counselor, taking the place of Haman, and the Jewish community still celebrate these events every year in the festival of Purim. So ironically enough, given that God is not mentioned in the story of Esther, it reminds us that he is always present. He is at work in ways that we cannot begin to discern. God's providence and sovereignty applies no less to us all today than it did for Esther and Mordecai. Like Esther, we're living in a culture that in so many ways is hostile to the belief and values of our faith, a post-Christian world in many respects. And we're working out our own response and our place in that world on a daily basis. Charles Spurgeon in 1884, we wouldn't believe this, but I found one of his book of sermons on our bookshelf, and it's his sermons on Old Testament women. So he actually had delivered this sermon on Esther in 1884 that I looked up during the week. And he preached on the relevance of Esther and her example and that message, and in 1884 he was saying it was no less relevant to them as it is for us today also. He said, "Special providence selected Esther for the throne. The same is true for each one of us now, occupying a post of usefulness." Many of you would be aware that I grew up in the Salvation Army, and one of the generals of the Salvation Army, who's the international leader, was actually an Australian woman who I met a few times, named Eva Burrows. And in reading some of her life stories as well, where she found herself in some many unusual situations, as you can imagine, travelling the world and many years on the mission field and over 50 years in ministry. She expressed this truth for herself when she said that we can never be put anywhere where God can't use us. In reflecting on her supreme confidence in this, I was led to recall the words of another song we sang frequently in the Salvation Army that was also written by a female minister who was the child of missionaries and served herself in ministry in many different countries and contexts. And she wrote so many decades ago, and we used to sing this song all the time. Just where he needs me, my Lord has placed me. Just where he needs me, there would I be. Just where I am, I'll speak the word of comfort, tell how for me Christ's sacrifice availed. And since he found me, by love he's bound me to serve him joyfully. So we're placed here tonight at All Souls in Leichhardt with an opportunity to learn from the example of the courageous faith of a Jewish queen in Persia, to see God's sovereignty and providence in the story of salvation for his chosen people from an imminent and very real threat. A story that continued to unfold then until Jesus Christ came to extend this salvation to all of us who accept his grace. And just as God used Esther to accomplish his will, so he's using all of us who are now in Christ to accomplish his will here in Leichhardt, in Sydney, in Australia, and here on earth. In her obedience, Esther embraced the meaning of her Persian name, which is star. She became a true star for God. And we are no less placed for God and his Son, Jesus Christ, here today. In Philippians 2, verses 15 and 16, Paul writes, "So that you may become blameless and pure, children of God, without fault, in a crooked and depraved generation, in which you shine like stars in the universe, as you hold out the word of life, in order that I may boast on the day of Christ that I did not run or labour for nothing." His grace is sufficient to sustain us when challenged, and the opportunities we have to serve and glorify Christ are endless. And we thank God tonight for the women of All Souls and for all of our church family here, and pray that we will seek his word to sustain us and continue to courageously live out our faith and his will for our lives wherever we find ourselves. The right people in the right place at the right time.